Welcome, and thank you for tuning in. You're listening to the Beyond 50 radio program. I'm Daniel Davis. On the program today, we're going to be talking about something that many of us think that you only get as a teenager, as a passing phase into adulthood, and that is acne. But you might be surprised to learn that over 20% of men and more than 35% of women actually get acne after the age of 30. A lot of things are cited as causing acne, things such as sugar, chocolate, or pizza, or maybe even dirty pillowcases, hormones, as well as genetics, but none of these causes have been able to explain the majority of acne cases, nor why chronic acne is on the rise. On the program today, we're going to be talking with someone who had cystic acne for more than 20 years. She had led her intelligence work to help her pinpoint exactly what was causing her treatment-resistant flare-ups. Fluoridated water, foods, dental products, and the systemic buildup of childhood fluoride treatments seem to be the culprit. I'd like to welcome to the Beyond 50 radio program today someone who is a former military intelligence officer, Fulbright scholar, and intelligence specialist at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I'd like to welcome to the program today our guest and the author of the book, The Hidden Cause of Acne, Melissa Gallego. Melissa, thank you for being on the program today.
Hi, Daniel. Thank you for having me.
You know, pretty amazing that you would actually hone the skills that you gained, not as a doctor or scientist, but an FBI intelligence officer to pursue this culprit known as acne. What was going on there?
Well, it was definitely out of necessity, personal motivation. I had, like you said, experienced chronic cystic acne. This is a very painful, welts that you can kind of feel them coming on your skin a week or two before you can even see them. So I'd experienced this for 2 decades, and it was just something that I knew I could figure out because I had a really big clue, and the clue was whenever I lived abroad, my skin was completely clear. And because of my job, I lived in Africa, Europe, the Caribbean, and my skin would clear up just effortlessly. I didn't do anything differently, and it was just completely clear. And then I'd come back to the U.S. even for a brief visit, and all of a sudden I would start getting these painful cystic breakouts again. So I knew that there was something causing my acne, and I knew it was something in the environment or something that I was being exposed to here in the United States that I wasn't being exposed to when I lived abroad. So that was the big clue that really gave me the confidence that I knew that I could figure this out.
Now, I know you were sharing examples of that, how it would actually disappear, and you would try to figure out, hey, what's going on here, and then it would seem to reappear when you were serving in the Navy, and there were 2 different ships that you were on now. Go ahead and talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, so I didn't figure this out until much later when I kind of developed the Fluoride Hypothesis and started testing that out. But so looking back, I was on a ship on the East Coast, and I had really bad skin, and I remember because the ship's doc one day knocked on my door and said, I noticed you have really bad acne. I can write you a prescription for that. So I know that my skin was really bad on that ship. And then just contrasting that with another ship that I was based on the West Coast, and I was only there for a month. This was during my midshipman cruise, and I remember when I checked in, I went to the ship's library just to get some books, to have on hand for if I had any downtime, I'd have something to do. And then at the end of my month, I checked those books back into the library, and the ship's librarian commented on my skin, and he said, wow, your skin really cleared up in the month that you've been here, which made me feel pretty uncomfortable, that people were remarking on my skin. But, that's how I remembered that my skin cleared up during that month on the ship. And the difference in the water is the ship on the East Coast, when I was on it, was taking on water from Norfolk Naval Station, which is fluoridated. And the ship on the West Coast was out at sea, and they were using reverse osmosis to purify the water. And so it was low in fluoride. So when I looked back years later, it made sense why my skin was, so bad on the ship on the East Coast and completely cleared up when I was on the West Coast.
Now, you pinpointed that it was fluoride. Now, let's go ahead and talk about, first of all, what fluoride exactly is there, because I know there's generally, my understanding, at least 2 types that I'm aware of. One is call it the medical fluoride, the things that dentists and doctors may use, and then there's also the other kind. But I'll go ahead and let you lead on this and give our audience an idea what fluoride is exactly.
Sure. So fluoride is an element on the periodic table, and it's right there between your minerals, your metals, and the noble gases. So it's in this little group called the halogens, and the other halogens are things like chlorine, bromine, and iodine. And so fluoride can combine with a lot of other elements to form different chemicals. So you have sodium fluoride, which is used in a lot of dental products, and then you have the fluoride added to the water supply, which is a different type of fluoride. Most of it is a byproduct of the phosphate fertilizer industry. So when they are doing these mining operations, fluoride is a very common element in the Earth's crust, so they'll naturally have fluoride as a byproduct of that. And that's typically the kind that is added to public water supplies.
So my understanding then is cities put this into the water. So why was that decision made?
That's a really good question. I had no idea about any of this when I initially started suspecting that fluoride was the cause of my acne. I didn't really know about the controversy around fluoridation. But since then, I've looked into it a lot more, and there is decades of science on public water fluoridation. But when you look at who funded this science, originally, back in the 30s, 40s, fluoride was better known as a pollutant. Before it was known as a dental product, it was a pollutant. So these mining industries, either aluminum factories or brick and mortar factories, like all kinds of mining industries would have fluoride as a byproduct, and it was causing a lot of damage to crops, to agriculture, and also to humans. So these companies were being sued. And they actually formed a fluorine lawyers committee to deal with the fluorine problem and try to figure out a way to limit their liability, and also something to do with this fluoride, because they started setting regulations on what could be released into the atmosphere. And so the bulk of the science on fluoridation, especially in those early years, was funded by these corporate polluters who had a huge financial self-interest in figuring out a way to give fluoride a makeover, basically, and make it more acceptable to the American people. So they have funded a lot of this research, and that's why the science has been so corrupted from the beginning. It's because of the pollution angle.
You bring up a really fascinating point. It's something that we have certainly talked about here on the program, and I've always taken a position of this. I want to put information out there. I try not to really be biased about what I share. The whole idea is you put it out there, and as I keep pounding away, at least at our listeners, do your homework, do your homework, do your homework. Just do it, okay? You go out and find out this stuff for yourself. Don't listen to me and the experts that bring on the air, but at least if we get you thinking a little bit, all right, well, what's the next step, okay? And the funny thing about science, too, I remember seeing this, it was on a YouTube video about nutrition. It was really funny what she said, a nice young gal about in her late 20s was saying, you can really get science to prove anything you want to. And certainly when you're reading your book here and in your experience, that seems to be true, doesn't it? Especially when we realize that we get these so-called experts that get in here and they begin to move public opinion. Now, one of the fascinating arenas of your book, I actually spent close to 5 years, I guess, studying this phenomenon, really goes back to the days of Edward Bernays. And you actually start talking about him and how we begin to see how our opinion really goes from opinion to fact and how it's swayed. So I'm going to go ahead and let you take the reins on this and how we came to believe that A, fluoride was actually good for our teeth, and B, how, hey, why not put it in the water? That way you don't have to worry about these yucky fluoride treatments that you get in the dentist, and how this may be good in the arena of preventing cavities and even further. So let's go ahead and talk about how all this happened.
Sure. So 1945, you had the first big government trial of fluoridation. And the man who led that 2 years later was named the head of the first federal dental institute. So the U.S. dental establishment was really based on this fluoridation idea, and he was a big proponent of it. 3 years after that, they just went ahead and endorsed fluoridation. So it had only been 5 years into what was supposed to be a 15-year trial. And they just decided, hey, this is working so well, let's just, fluoridate the control city. There was supposed to be, a fluoridated and a non-fluoridated city so they could compare the rates of dental decay and how fluoride affected that. But they just fluoridated the control city, so they had no comparison. And so you can see they didn't really take their time doing long-term toxicity studies of how fluoride might affect other parts of the body. And so once fluoridation was approved, then they had to get people on board with it because there was a lot of resistance. People realized that it was a pollutant. This was still fresh in everyone's minds of how it had, damaged tens of thousands of acres of agricultural land. So that's really when the marketers took over. And you mentioned Edward Bernays. He's known as the father of public relations. He was actually the nephew of Sigmund Freud. So he used a lot of Sigmund Freud's psychological insights in his marketing campaign. He wrote a book called Propaganda. So he realized, he was manipulating experts. And he talks about just what you said. You can find an expert to endorse anything, really. So then it's just a matter of statistics, finding that expert, one in however many who is going to endorse whatever it is you're trying to sell. And he's most well known for promoting cigarettes, kind of breaking the social stigma around women smoking in public, which really opened up the market for cigarette manufacturers, but he also worked on fluoridation. And he would intentionally leverage authority figures, not just doctors, but also things like dictionaries and journalists, the daily news. He knew if people saw it on the news or they saw it in the dictionary, fluoride is a water additive that promotes strong teeth, then they would believe it. So he intentionally leveraged those authority sources to establish fluoride as this beneficial nutrient. And there's even been, I've seen documents where the U.S. Public Health Service has said, fluoride is an essential mineral nutrient, but it was never proven as an essential mineral. Usually, if you restrict an essential mineral from the diet, there's these predictable side effects that develop. But we never get that with fluoride. There's societies that consume very little fluoride, and they have perfect teeth. So we know it's not an essential nutrient, and more often it's actually hazardous because it doesn't just affect teeth. It also accumulates in your bones. There's a lot of studies that it has neurotoxic effects. And these are things that they just didn't consider at the time. We didn't really have the science to look at those things back then, and also we didn't want to because of the corporate interest in promoting fluoridation. So a lot of that has come to light now, but it's really hard to go back and change something that you're so vested in. Like we've been doing fluoridation for so many decades, and all these authority figures are saying, yeah, it's great, it really helps with dental decay, and they're just blocking out all information to the contrary.
So now let's talk about how fluoride affects people and the way that it did you. What's going on in the body? I mean, you talk about how we've ingested this, at levels and increments over years. What's going on there?
Yeah, so fluoride is known to bioaccumulate. And the National Academy of Sciences, they estimate that the half-life of fluoride is 20 years. So that means, or half-life of fluoride in bone is 20 years. So when you consume fluoride, part of that is sequestered in your bones, and 20 years from now, half of that amount is still going to be in your body. So for me, I was exposed to fluoride pills when I was a child. My family, we had a house with well water, so we didn't have a lot of fluoride in the water, and the dentist recommended these fluoride pills. So I started taking the fluoride pills when I was really little, and clearly we didn't know this at the time, but I started developing nosebleeds. My teeth, when they came in, my permanent teeth, I had dental fluorosis, which is an indicator of fluoride toxicity. Your body's getting too much fluoride. And it's just like a discoloring of the tooth enamel. Mine is it's like an opaque sheen around the tooth enamel, so it's very subtle. People don't notice it, but it's very common. And they're estimating that it's gone up, I think it's almost 50% now of adolescents have signs of dental fluorosis, which means they're just getting too much fluoride during those formative years when their teeth are developing. So depending on when you're exposed, it accumulates in your body at different, in different ways and affects you in different ways. But if it's during those early years, you'll have dental fluorosis. It's also going into your bones, and we don't really know where else. There was one grad student in the UK who dissected 11 cadaver pineal glands and discovered the highest concentrations of fluoride in the human body. And that's a brain organ, so that's not something that dentists were studying back in the 50s. We barely have an idea like how it works, and we know it regulates sleep, and an important part of the body, but there's very high concentrations of fluoride there. So we're really just beginning to understand how fluoride affects the body on a systemic level.
Now, the one thing you certainly talk about is how fluoride is certainly found as a waste byproduct of commercial fertilizer. So let's go ahead and take a look at how that tumbles there. You take a look at, well, why do we use fertilizer? Obviously to fertilize crops, maybe even the grass that's in your lawn. But then you take a look at the fact that animals ingest this fertilization that we have here. So people say, well, if I stop drinking fluoridated water, shouldn't that sort of end what happens there? But it actually goes a lot further than that, doesn't it?
Yeah, fluoride, water is the biggest source in dental products, so just toothpaste in general and gels and things that you'd be exposed to at the dentist. But it's also infiltrated the food supplies in ways that we wouldn't necessarily think of, not just because of fluoridated water, so anything manufactured with fluoridated water, like soft drinks or juices, or even things like pasta, rice, mashed potatoes. If you're going out to eat and getting these things from a restaurant that uses fluoridated water, that food will contain fluoride. But there are other sources of fluoride besides the water, and mainly it's because fluoride is used as a pesticide. It's very commonly used on grape crops in California. So if you're getting your wine from California, it can be very high on fluoride. Grape juice, I think Gerber's white grape juice they did a study of different types of ready-to-drink juices, and they had the highest amount of fluoride. It was over 8 parts per million. For water, the maximum level is 4 parts per million, so it was double that. And this is something that's targeted at children. Other food sources are chicken products. So when chickens eat feed that has fluoride-based pesticides, it accumulates in their bones, just like with humans. So chicken products were some of my worst sources of acne flare-ups. I would have like chicken soup because it's made with the bones. You simmer the bones in water, and it's very high on fluoride. And I would get these really horrible flare-ups, and I had no idea what was going on until I realized that those bones contain fluoride. So, and then the other major source is black tea. And this is just because tea happens to be pretty much the only edible plant that naturally uptakes fluoride directly from the soil. So even if it's organic and they didn't use fluoride-based pesticides, and even if the tea is made with non-fluoridated water, it will be very high in fluoride just because of, the characteristics of the plant. And they've had cases where people have developed arthritis-like symptoms just from drinking tea. And then they stop drinking the tea, and those symptoms go away. There was just a study posted in May in the New Zealand Medical Journal with a 79-year-old woman. She had a hip replacement, 2 knee replacements, and then they realized she was drinking several cups of tea a day. So she cut out the tea, and her arthritis completely subsided. So they wrote up an article and published it there. But there are several case studies like that in the literature, but for some reason it just hasn't made it into mainstream knowledge that fluoride can cause these symptoms.
Now, how did you come to the conclusion yourself that fluoride was the cause of your acne? Was it just simply because you stopped and over time it just seemed to disappear? Or what was it? Because I know that you also talk a lot about in your book how you were using a lot of skin cleansers and products, things like that, but it just didn't seem to make things any better.
Yeah, so the first 20 years when I was unsuccessfully treating my acne, I used all of the common skincare products. I went on prescription medications, and a lot of those things do help, but it's temporary. They had side effects, and when you go off them, you're right back where you started, or it's even worse. So I never was able to get at the root cause of my acne through those conventional treatments. When I initially suspected the water, at first I thought maybe it was lead exposure because that's the toxin that you think of first with water supply, but I didn't find any correlation with that. I thought maybe it was something with the pipes. And then finally, I developed this fluoride hypothesis, and I think originally I had just read there's a lot of literature that topical fluoride applications can cause acne. But I just made that leap. Maybe when you drink it, it can also cause acne. It seemed like a logical idea, and so I decided to test it out. And the first thing I did was stop drinking fluoridated water, and I saw a big improvement. So that let me know that I was on the right track. And then I would get a big flare-up, and I would think, oh, I must not have this figured out. But then I would go back and realize I'd look at what I ate, and I would use Google to look up fluoride research on PubMed, and I would realize, oh, there's actually, fluoride in that chicken broth, or, oh, that beer I ordered from Europe happens to be one of the few cities in Europe that actually fluoridates their water supply. That makes sense. So it took me a little over a year, I guess, to really figure out all the other sources of fluoride that I was being exposed to besides the water, and really refine my theory and figure out exactly where all this fluoride was coming from in my diet.
So now, how many countries, let's call them civilized or industrialized countries around the world, actually put fluoride in their water?
I don't know the number, but
maybe just a rough guess, for instance.
Yeah, the English-speaking countries, definitely, U.S., Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the U.K., Ireland. That's where it's the biggest. Israel has gone back and forth. And then most of Western Europe doesn't. I think 97% of Western Europe doesn't. And the Fluoride Action Network actually wrote to each of those countries and posted their response on their website. So you can go in and see their reasoning in their own words of why they don't fluoridate. So that was really interesting. A lot of them said it was ethical reasons because they think compulsory mass medication is unethical. Some of them it was for medical reasons. Some of them just said that there's better ways to prevent cavities. And there are small portions of those countries, like Spain, I think, has a portion that will fluoridate. Russia maybe has a little bit of fluoridation from my understanding. So there are pockets of it in non-English-speaking countries, but it's really the countries that the U.S. has influenced the most of these, our English-speaking partners that seem to be all gung-ho about fluoridation.
So now it seems to me that now that we're becoming more aware of this, that more and more people are becoming aware and getting on board with the fact that maybe they want to reverse the idea of putting fluoride in the water. How's that going?
So how would you reverse it?
Well, yeah, that's what I'm saying is that you were talking about how in the book that, that it seems that countries are actually, as well as the United States, people are starting to say, look, we're finding studies, this isn't so good. Are they beginning to reverse that process and tell, for instance, our governments, stop doing this?
Oh, yeah. So it's mostly at the local level where people are having success. So, a town, the citizens will organize and they'll force a vote and they'll take fluoride out of the water. So there have been a lot of towns that have had success organizing in that way. On the national level, there's still a long way to go for that to happen, especially in the U.S. But I do think awareness of that is growing, especially as people become more skeptical about government health policy and they start to see the way that corporations have influenced the science.
Now, what are some treatments that you actually talk about in your book that you could outline for our listeners to maybe get started with to reverse maybe the process that fluoridated water or, products can actually, remove some of the outcomes like what you had with the chronic acne?
Well, I think the most important thing is figuring out how to limit your fluoride exposure. And so for most people, if they cut out fluoridated toothpaste and fluoridated water, they'll see an improvement right away. So that's a good sign that your body is responding to the fluoride. And then after that, it's just a matter of those other lesser-known sources. So cutting out tea, if you drink a lot of tea, cutting that out, eating organic produce, especially any grape products or poultry products. And then cereal is also can be very high in fluoride just because it concentrates during the manufacturing process. So cutting out any potentially high fluoride cereals that you're eating. And then, I think that's the main thing is avoiding fluoride. In the book, I also talk about iodine. There's other ways that you can detoxify fluoride from your body, but I had a lot of trouble with that initially. So I always recommend people get rid of the fluoride first, which will clear up your skin, and then you can slowly add in iodine after that. So it's just because iodine displaces fluoride from your body, so it can cause a lot of the same symptoms that fluoride exposure causes when it's initially going in. So iodine can cause acne, it can cause digestive problems because it's releasing all this fluoride back into circulation. So I always recommend cutting out the fluoride first and then slowly adding in iodine.
Yeah, don't go crazy and reverse it because something is good like we tend to do in America. We tend to think, well, more is better. You're going to be in a world of hurt.
That got me into trouble, just being impatient and trying to jump ahead. So I really had to go slow and listen to my body and make sure I wasn't, moving too quickly.
Now, what kind of resistance have you faced personally? I mean, people can take a look and say, well, what is somebody who's an FBI investigator? That's not a doctor, that's not a scientist, but you got to think about, well, what you actually do is you meticulously, you research, you actually investigate, even more than a journalist in most cases. But what kind of resistance have you experienced in writing this book, The Hidden Cause of Acne?
Not too much at this point. I don't know if that will change the more the word gets out, but I think it's not just me that's noticed this reaction. I initially, before I wrote the book, I just started writing about it on the internet, and I would connect with other people who they said, wow, that helped me too. Thanks for mentioning that. I cut out fluoride and my skin cleared up. So right from the beginning, it wasn't just my account. There were other people who were corroborating what I was saying. And then I did a free guide that I posted online, so I got a lot of testimonials from that, and I turned it into an ebook on Amazon, and people started putting in the review section like, yeah, my acne cleared up in 1 month, and I've had it for 30 years. So those are really strong testimonials, and I just started collecting like before and after pictures, and when you see it with your own eyes, and these are real people, you can go to their Instagram accounts and see, like, these are real people, and they're just talking about their experience. And I think we're kind of becoming familiar with these different sensitivities. So many people are sensitive to corn and grains, and people are sensitive to everything. So it's not that outlandish to think there are people who are sensitive to fluoride. And I think the more people realize that it can cause acne and it can cause arthritis and it does cause problems with the thyroid gland, people like in my situation, we're really desperate for real cures because you've dealt with the conservative, the conventional treatments, and you just know they don't get at the root cause. So when someone's giving you this idea and it doesn't cost you a lot of money to cut fluoride from your diet, I'm not trying to sell people filters or anything, I'm just sharing this information, I think it resonates with them because they know, like, oh, this is me. Like, I get a lot of people who just see the pictures of my skin and they're like, that's my face, because the pattern is very familiar. It would be breakouts like right along your jawline, these really painful cystic breakouts. So I think when people see the pictures, a lot of times it resonates. And I do get the occasional comment on Twitter like, oh, this is a conspiracy theory, but I just those aren't the people.
Well, you got to love the internet, the bathroom wall of the world where anybody can say, ooh, that's a conspiracy, and everybody gets involved. And, I think that's funny, too, because I think one of the most enjoyable and important parts of your book is when you talk about how branding, and how all that works, in the work of Edward Bernays. And to give you a funny example of that, I remember years ago we were out on this farm up in Washington, which is around the Mount Adams area. And this is a place where the guy welcomes people to come onto his farm at night to do UFO watching, okay? And what's funny about this is it's a great place to go because you see Mount Adams off in the distance at night. It's beautiful. And just if you're out there looking at billions of stars, that alone makes it worth the trip. And anyway, there was a point, though, when we were out there on this particular night that it looked like a helicopter was going out and approaching the mountain. So the guy who lived there happened to start with, well, that's pretty unusual that you see a helicopter up there at this time at night. Something must be going on because normally helicopters or, people of air control aren't supposed to be up there. So he said that and just kind of put that out there a little bit. Then all of a sudden, as others got curious about it, you started hearing the ripple effect, and it was like the story was changing. Yeah, they're really not supposed to be up there. So now all of a sudden people in the crowd, or not a huge crowd, obviously, but, that were there, began to become experts about what people should and should not be able to be doing at that time of night around Mount Adams. And I found that funny, how everybody just began piggybacking, and I'm like, I was talking to my wife, and I said, do you hear what's going on here? This is kind of funny, and at the time I was studying a lot of that, the idea of propaganda and branding and so forth, and it's funny how that works.
Yeah.
So, and on the internet, it's no different.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
There was like a guest I had on the program one time. Simply says, "Do you know why you watch the news?" And I said, "Well, I don't watch it, but why?" And he says, "So you can support your biases."
Oh yeah,
crazy stuff. That's why I wondered, how you were obviously the book and your work is being received well from people who have actually said, "Well, why don't I go ahead and just stop drinking? First of all, find out if your water has fluoride. Just stop drinking it. See how you begin to feel. That just makes sense. That's logical. Take a look at your foods that may have fluoride in them. See about cutting those back. And, just kind of taking the steps to take a look at what may have fluoride in them in high concentrations. And just see about removing those and just see what happens, which is exactly what you seem to do.
Exactly, yeah. And it's so easy to tell because the reaction is within a day. It's not something that you drink fluoride and like 2 weeks later your skin will break out. It's relatively quick, so it's easy for people to test this out for themselves, and it doesn't cost a lot of money, it doesn't take a lot of time, and it's pretty strong evidence when you can see the reaction in your own skin.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you for taking the time to be on our program, Melissa, and share this work, The Hidden Cause of Acne. I think people should actually take a look at this and at least begin to ask the question and take the steps forward. Up in Portland, Oregon, where I used to live, they were actually going to fluoridate the water up there. And what was really fascinating about this whole thing was a governing body just decided they were going to do it. We're just going to fluoridate the water. We're not going to ask anybody or have voters even ask, voting to see if it's okay. They just were going to do it. And what was funny was the citizens, some of them actually heard about this, and it turned into a big thing after that. They said, hold on a minute, you're just going to put fluoride in the water, you're not going to ask any of us if it's okay, you're just going to do it. Who gave you the permission and the power to do this? It got real big to where it actually was put to a vote, and of course, again, it was turned down unanimously. And I think most of it was just because they were pissed because the government just decided to do it and not ask any permission. And so it showed real power in the people there, and the power to vote and to be proactive in government. And so I guess Portland still remains the largest city in the United States with unfluoridated water, but take a look at that, and it was really fascinating how the debate was going on. We even brought people on the program to talk about, the pros and the cons of fluoride in the water. But my simple question is, in nature, do you find fluoride in the water? Really. Nobody really seemed to be asking that question.
Right. It's only in these deep water wells where fluoride is common, but in surface water, it's generally 0.05 parts per million, and what the government recommends is 0.7. So that's, several times higher than what you would find in nature. You can still find water, wells that have high amount of fluoride, but usually fresh water is very low in fluoride.
Well, thank you so much for being on the program again. How can people find out about your work? Is there a website they can go to, things like that, to get the book and maybe even talk to you?
Yeah, hiddencauseofacne.com has information about the book, has a contact form, and also if you have listeners who want to do something about fluoridation, I have a petition at change.org. You can find it just by going to petition.projectfree.me, and it will reroute you to my petition at change.org to stop the federal government from recommending the addition of fluoride to public water supplies.
Absolutely, because more certainly is not better. At least you found out that the hard way.
Yes, in several years.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad that things are working well for you. You're looking good and helping a lot of people feel and do the very same thing for themselves. Again, the book is The Hidden Cause of Acne. Our guest joining us, Melissa Gallego. Melissa, thank you so much for being on the program today.
Thank you, Daniel. My pleasure.
We want to thank you, the listeners out there, for tuning in. You can also do more by visiting us at beyond50radio.com. That is the number 50. We do encourage you to sign up for our weekly e-newsletter and keep up to date with what's going on in the world of Beyond 50 as well as our upcoming programs. I'm Daniel Davis. Thank you for joining us. This is the Beyond 50 radio program, and remember, live your day past halfway.